Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I have had a few interventions this fall, but this is actually my first opportunity to rise and take part in debate, so if you will indulge me, I just want to extend my appreciation to the great people of the Kenora riding and across northwestern Ontario for their trust to represent them in this place. I just recently surpassed my 5-year anniversary as a Member of Parliament as well, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleagues. And it's always very humbling and always an honour to be able to rise in this place to speak on behalf of the people of northwestern Ontario. And today, of course, we are speaking about a very important matter. I wish I could say that this debate is unprecedented, or that this motion is unprecedented, but this is not the first time that this government has disobeyed, disregarded, or otherwise simply not cared about an order that this House has made. Now, when I was first elected over 5 years ago, I made a promise to the people of northwestern Ontario, Mr. Speaker, the people that put their trust in me to represent them here and fight for their best interests. And that promise is to ensure that government is acting in their best interests and spending their tax dollars responsibly. And that is something that we have not seen this government do. So currently, the regular business of this House, as many know at this point, it's been on hold because this government refuses to hand over documents that the House has ordered of it. This is preventing us from doing anything. We're at an absolute standstill, but it's preventing us from addressing other issues that this NDP Liberal government has caused, such as the doubling of housing costs, Mr. Speaker, the creating of the housing crisis, where we see many young people that have given up completely on their dream of home ownership, the affordability crisis, the infrastructure gap in First Nations, or the crime this government has unleashed by breaking the bail system and implementing catch-and-release policies for violent criminals. Mr. Speaker, all of these issues are on the back burner now because the government is instead choosing to gridlock Parliament. And they are the only ones that have the power to end it. If they were to comply with the House order, hand over all the documents related to the Green Slush Fund, we could get back to the regularly scheduled programming of this House. Instead, the government is going to great lengths to protect itself and withhold what I would imagine is very damaging information if they are willing to go to such great extent. Mr. Speaker, I just want to touch a bit about parliamentary privilege. Of course, it is a crucial function to ensure the legislative branch of government can meet one of its main objectives, and that is holding this government accountable. And with this privilege comes extraordinary powers to ensure the government cannot interfere with us as parliamentarians meeting that objective. And in particular, Mr. Speaker, this privilege includes the power to order the production of documents the House deems necessary to carry out its duties. There is, and this is important, there is not a similar privilege afforded to the government to refuse an order for the production of said documents. And I will get back a bit more to that later, Mr. Speaker, but I first want to talk about why we are here discussing this motion before us. So last year, as folks at home know, as members of this House know, we learned of allegations that Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC, the organization the government entrusted to administer its billion-dollar Green Slush Fund, was grossly mismanaging this fund. When a former employee blew the whistle, Mr. Speaker, the government commissioned Raymond Shabbat Grant Thornton to inquire about the allegations. Their report later confirmed a number of those allegations to be true. If we fast forward from that point to December 11th of last year, 2023, one of those employees testified at the industry committee, Mr. Speaker. And this former employee outlined how tens of millions of taxpayer dollars were misspent by SDTC. Alongside that, there were conflicts of interest and senior level managers that were playing favorites. On top of all of that, Mr. Speaker, when concerns were raised, those complaints were never taken seriously and were always swept under the rug. This is the testimony that was heard at committee. The whistleblower made clear that the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry and his office knew about the corruption within Sustainable Development Technology Canada and helped to cover it up. The whistleblower said, and this is a quote, "The minister has spoken on the record multiple times that he was only briefed on the outcome on August 27th, but that's definitively not true." Mr. Speaker, he also went on to say that the minister and PCO, which is the Privy Council Office, have been aware of this file for more than they are telling to the public, and there are even documented evidence that they even engaged with everyone at the department, at ISED, to make sure that there were edits to the briefings before they were officially sent to them. All of this is backed up by documents, transcripts, and recordings, some of which we've already submitted to this committee. Mr. Speaker, that is disgraceful and shocking allegations about the improper use of taxpayer dollars. That would not be taken seriously and that the minister would cover it up is even worse. At that point, the committee had also learned that Liberal appointed members violated conflict of interest rules, and alongside the committee's investigation, the Auditor General and Ethics Commissioner were doing their own investigations. Now, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, under this government, it becomes even more unsurprising of what they have allowed to happen under their watch. As we look to the Industry Committee's meeting from January 31st of this year, during that meeting, Leah Lawrence, the former president and CEO of SDTC, told the committee that she warned the government about the board chair's conflict of interest. Mr. Speaker, that's very clear. The government was warned about this conflict of interest. She had also told the committee about the chair's conflicts of interest. However, she disregarded them and sent money to her own company, that being the chair. Ms. Lawrence's testimony also said that she shared those concerns with former Liberal Minister Navdeep Bain's office, but the Liberals allowed the chair to stay in charge, Mr. Speaker. Despite Liberal claims that they only learned about the abuse of the fund this year, Ms. Lawrence's testimony made very clear to all parliamentarians and indeed to all Canadians that they have known about it since 2019, Mr. Speaker, 5 years ago. I will also note at that time that the government and the NDP Liberal government and the Bloc Québécois actually were refusing to get documents from SDTC that would expose the level of corruption at this organization. Disclosure documents had also gone missing or were filled out after the fact when the probe asked for them. A report into SDTC said the conflict of interest policy was inconsistently applied. Now, if we're going through the timeline, as we've been doing so, Mr. Speaker, and we fast forward a little bit more to June 4th of this year, the Auditor General released a damning report about Sustainable Development Technology Canada. She, the Auditor General, found that the government had turned SDTC into a slush fund for Liberal insiders. She also found that SDTC had awarded funding to projects that were ineligible and where conflicts of interest existed. In total, $123 million worth of contracts were found to have been given inappropriately, with $59 million being given to projects that never should have been awarded any money at all, Mr. Speaker. On top of this, the Auditor General discovered that conflicts of interest were connected to approval decisions. As a consequence of this, nearly $76 million of funding was awarded to projects where there was a connection to the Liberals' friends appointed to roles within SDTC, while $12 million of funding was given to projects that were both ineligible and had a conflict of interest. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General discovered that long-established conflict of interest policies were not followed in 90 instances. In one case, the Prime Minister's hand-picked chair siphoned off over $200,000 $200,000 to her own company. The Auditor General made it very clear that the blame for this scandal lies directly at the feet of the Prime Minister's industry minister, who did not sufficiently monitor the contracts that were being awarded to Liberal insiders. He utterly failed, Mr. Speaker, in his duty to protect the Canadian taxpayer. Following the revelation from the AG's report, from the Auditor General's report, Common Sense Conservatives put forward a motion that required the government, SDTC, and the Auditor General to hand over all relevant documents related to this scandal that are in their possession within 30 days of the motion being adopted. This motion, of course, Mr. Speaker, passed on June 10th of this year, with only Liberal MPs, go figure, opposing it. And that brings us today. We'll jump ahead to today, Mr. Speaker, and why we are discussing this issue. Since the adoption of the order, the government has refused to comply. And that's really what it comes down to, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the government could end this all, get the House back working on, frankly, their legislative priorities. But they are choosing to hold up their legislative priorities, if we can call them that, because their only priority right now is to ensure that Canadians don't get answers and that there is no accountability shed on this scandal. So the Conservative House Leader raised a question of privilege, Mr. Speaker, as we know. And in the days leading up to the Speaker's ruling, the government tried to justify their defiance, arguing that Parliament may have exceeded its authority, they said, when it adopted the order in the Speaker's ruling. In the Speaker's ruling, he noted the procedural precedents and authorities are abundantly clear. The House has the undoubted right to order the production of any and all documents from the entity or individual it deems necessary to carry out its duties. Moreover, these powers are a settled matter, at least as far as the House is concerned. They have been confirmed and reconfirmed by my immediate predecessors as well as those most distantly removed. That is from the Speaker's ruling, Mr. Chair. He also quoted page 985 of House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, which I will quote for the benefit of members of this House. No statute or practice diminishes the fullness of that power rooted in House privileges unless there is an explicit legal provision to that effect or unless the House adopts a specific resolution limiting the power. The House has never set a limit on its power to order the production of papers. Mr. Speaker, that brings me back to the privileges we as members of this House enjoy, whether it be individually or collectively as a chamber. In this case, it is clear that the government is violating one of our collective privileges as members of Parliament. And unfortunately, this is not the first time the government has refused to comply with an order of the House. I know many of previous speakers have also highlighted this as well, Mr. Speaker. Many of us will remember the Winnipeg Lab scandal. How could you forget? At the time, the House again ordered, among other things, that the government hand over all relevant documents. And just as they are now, the government refused to comply with the order, and instead, trying to suggest it complied with the order by sending the documents to the Prime Minister's controlled National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. The Speaker at the time ruled that that was not acceptable, since said committee was not a parliamentary committee. What the government did next, however, Mr. Speaker, that's what was really shocking. They took the Speaker at that time to court to argue that the government has the legal authority to withhold documents requested by this House. Can you imagine that, Mr. Speaker? The government taking the Speaker to court. It is absolutely unheard of. And though there was never a court ruling because the government called an early, unnecessary pandemic election shortly after, effectively canceling the order to produce those documents, it shows just how far the government will go to disregard the will of Parliament, and by extension, the will of all Canadians who brought us to this place, who elected us as members of Parliament to represent them. Mr. Speaker, it is beyond unacceptable that the government has continued to defy the House order to hand over the documents. The government has caused this place to be in gridlock. You've heard the word paralyzed for almost 3 weeks now, and it begs the question, are the documents truly that damaging to the government? They must be. I heard one of my colleagues say, Mr. Speaker, they must be. The government does not want to talk about moving any of their agenda items forward. They don't want to talk about the issues that are facing Canadians day to day. They would rather Parliament be completely focused on this issue rather than comply with the order and be accountable to Canadians. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this issue this issue of corruption and scandal within the Liberal government is not something that is new. I mentioned the Winnipeg Lab scandal, Mr. Speaker, but the list goes on. This has become really a trend with this government to the point that many Canadians have almost become numb to these scandals. If you ask Canadians on the street how they feel about the Liberal government scandal, they ask which one, because there's so many to choose from, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to share some of them here as well. And this is unfortunately a very small subset of the scandals the government has found itself in. Certainly not an exhaustive list. We all remember the Aga Khan vacation, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister accepted a family vacation to a private island of the Aga Khan, a wealthy leader who happened to have lobbied the government on several occasions. The Prime Minister was found guilty of ethics violations there. There was also the Cash for Access fundraisers, where the Prime Minister held private fundraisers for wealthy donors who could pay for access to him as the Prime Minister and to his senior ministers. These events led to allegations that the donors were effectively buying access to decision makers. But there's more, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister also found himself in hot water when he charged taxpayers $6,000 per night for his hotel room while in England attending the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. One of the more well-known scandals, the We Charity scandal, draws a lot of similarities actually to this SDTC Green Slush Fund scandal, Mr. Speaker. In particular, money being given where a conflict of interest exists. In the We Charity case, the Ethics Commissioner found then Finance Minister Bill Morneau broke the law by violating the Conflict of Interest Act. And finally, we also have the SNC-Lavalin scandal, Mr. Speaker, where the Prime Minister and other senior officials tried to pressure then Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to intervene in a criminal case against SNC-Lavalin. When she refused, she was kicked out of cabinet and, of course, out of caucus. And the Prime Minister was found guilty, once again, by the Ethics Commissioner. Mr. Speaker, this has become a pattern with this government. And it's caused a lot of Canadians to become incredibly frustrated or perhaps even jaded with politicians in general, because all they see is scandal after scandal coming from this government. So I want to end my speech, Mr. Speaker, with a message to Canadians, that this is not how your government should be ran. Your government shouldn't be caught up in scandal after scandal, improperly spending taxpayer dollars and trying to cover it up, or trying to give your money to well-connected Liberal insiders. And that's why Conservatives are going to keep fighting for you as Canadians by getting to the bottom of this scandal. Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve to know what is in those documents that the government is hiding, and anyone who broke the law should certainly be prosecuted. It is clear that this government is not worth the cost or the corruption, and that only common sense Conservatives will take action to clean up this mess. Mr. Speaker, above all, it is time for a carbon tax election so that Canadians can elect a common sense Conservative government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, stop the crime, and stop the corruption. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.